Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution and specifically discussing types of natural selection. So let's get into this next video. So let's go through and review fitness to make sure we understand this concept here. Fitness is a measure of reproductive success, and it's going to be how many offspring an organism leaves in the next generation relative to others in the group. And this is going to fundamentally depend upon the process of natural selection. And natural selection is a process that results in living things with beneficial traits producing more offspring than others, and this results in changes in the traits of living things over time. We've gone through and talked about this a lot in this unit of evolution and population genetics. Now, there are going to be three specific types of natural selection that we're going to go through and talk about today in this video. The first is going to be stabilizing selection. The second is going to be disruptive selection. And then the third is going to be directional selection. So let's go through and look at stabilizing selection in a little bit more detail so that way we can understand this. Now, before we talk about stabilizing selection, we have to talk about the distribution of a normal bell curve. And this is review from another video that we've gone through and looked at already. But if we look at this, we're going to have, in most scenarios, a normal distribution of traits. In this case, we're going to have a bell curve that's going to represent the size of these tuna fish. And when we see a bell curve like this, and when we compare this bell curve against the other curves that we're going to look at, what we see is that the average traits are going to be the most common in the middle when we see this specific curve. And this hump or this bell curve is representing the number of individuals of a particular size. Now, stabilizing selection is going to occur when phenotypes at both extremes of the phenotypic distribution are selected against. So if we were to go through and compare this to our normal distribution on a bell curve, well, stabilizing selection is going to look something like this. So stabilizing selection is going to be this process that we can go through and talk about when we talk about bird eggs. In a scenario of bird eggs, what we're going to see here is we're going to see distributions of a certain quantity of eggs. On the case of the left-hand side, we're going to see that there are a relatively small amount of eggs. On the right-hand side, we have a large quantity of eggs. In the middle, we have an average quantity of eggs. And stabilizing selection is going through and it's trying to get rid of both of those extremes on either end. Why is this not necessarily beneficial for organisms to have lots of eggs and have too few of eggs? Well, if there's lots of eggs and the chicks go through and hatch, that's going to be a somewhat energy exhaustive burden for the mother and father bird to go through and collect for that many organisms and that many individuals. The birds will not have the capability, or the mother and father birds will simply not have the capability to feed that many chicks. So that trait is going to be selected against. Now, too few of eggs is really not going to allow for that mother and father bird to have a large quantity of offspring, and that's also not beneficial because those individuals are not passing on their genes. So what we see is we see an in the middle or a median quantity of eggs that are going to be most beneficial and selected for because they're going to require the least amount of energy to go through and feed, but are going to maximize the reproductive success of those partner birds. Now, disruptive selection is a selection that's going to occur when phenotypes in the middle range are selected against. And this is going to result in two overlapping phenotypes, one at each end of the distribution. So if our normal bell curve look like this, well, a disruptive selection is going to look like this. So when is this going to go through and occur? Well, in some fish populations, we can see that this occurs, and it's going to select for the small size fish and the large size fish as compared to the average fish. Now, what's the reason behind this? Well, the larger fish are going to be the ones that are going to be able to fertilize the eggs that the females go through and lay down because they're the largest and they can go through and push all the other fish out of the way. Now, the smaller fish are also going to be able to go through and reproduce because they're small enough to go through and sneak past the larger fish and go through and fertilize the female eggs. Now, fish in the middle range are going to be too large to go through and sneak past the other salmon, but too small to go through and kind of push and fend them off. So as a result, we see this disruptive selective curve. So disruptive selection selects against the middle range, or what would be in the average if we were to see a normal bell curve. Now, last but not least, we have directional selection. And directional selection occurs when one of two extreme phenotypes is selected for, but only one of them. And this is going to shift the distribution towards that extreme. Now, we can represent directional selection with a skewed normal curve here, like this, and this represents our directional selection, or we can go through and look at it when we talk about our peppered moths here. Now, in the case of our peppered moths, what we saw was that based on bark selection, the moths that were kind of this intermediate gray color went through and survived the best because that was the color of the trees. And we saw very dark and very light colored moths, but in the middle we see these peppered moths that match with the trees. Now, an environmental change goes through and occurs, and it forces the tree bark to turn this dark soot color. And as a result, we see selection for the dark colored moths because now they can go through and camouflage with the dark colored bark. And again, what we see here is now the light colored moths are being selected against, as well as the gray colored moths, and only the dark colored moths are being selected for when we're going through and seeing this environmental change. So directional selection is going to select for one extreme and is usually going to be due to some drastic environmental change that we see within an environment. So these are going to be our three types of natural selection that we see: stabilizing, disruptive, and directional. And these are going to be specific types of natural selection that are going to depend on very specific scenarios and environments that organisms go through and live in. So did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys learn about the other types of natural selection? So that's going to include stabilizing, disruptive, and directional. And then lastly, did you learn about how these types may affect the populations and what organisms are selected for? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.